my name is Nate and welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me here. If this is the first video of mine you've clicked on, welcome. This video will just be wrapping up all of the books that I have read throughout the month of July. This video will be a bit differently. I've tried to film it throughout the month, so as I finish the video I try to film a video wrapping up my thoughts about that video, and then I was just going to put all them together in this video. I was successful in that for half of the books, but then towards the end of the month I kind of just forgot, and so I have a few books here that we'll talk about. But first I will do it in order and we'll play the clips in order of the books that I read throughout the month. Let's get on to that. Okay, so the first book I read in the month of July is City of Ashes. This is book 2 in the Mortal Instruments series, the first one being City of Bone, and I really enjoyed this book. I really did. I gave this about a 4.5 star. This is by Cassandra Clare, obviously. Yeah, I gave this 4.5 star. I really enjoyed it. I think it started off, I kind of, not took longer to get into it, but it started off, I think, a bit, I don't know if it felt a bit rushed, but I was also listening to the audiobook, I think, while doing something, so I don't know if I was just distracted, because after about, I think, 100 pages of listening to the audiobook, I switched and just read the rest of it physically, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I really liked the character development, or like the character changes we saw, especially in Clary and Simon. I really like Simon. Jace annoys me in his kind of attitude of always kind of, I guess, thinking, not necessarily he thinks he's above everyone else, but it's kind of that attitude of not really accepting house, thinking he can do anything, going off on his own. That kind of attitude really annoys me. We did get some like kind of development, I guess, in his and Clary's relationship. I think overall I really enjoyed this. There is obviously there's a kind of big bad throughout the whole, like, encapsulating. I'm assuming he's going to be like throughout the whole of the series, so we get a bit more of him in this series, but obviously it's not quite resolved. This is the second out of 6 books, so there's a lot more to go. I have no idea what that much more is going to be to go, but we'll see. We didn't get as much of Alec and Isabel in this one, and I think I liked Alec better in this book than I did in the first book. I think he was just quite a bit arrogant in the first book. Cassandra Clare still does do like her thing of like slight misogyny from Clary, so I guess self-misogyny or internalized misogyny Clary seems to have, or at least to other women, which at least she kind of recognized at one point, just like the way that she kind of talks about women sometimes. Like Maya is just described as, oh, this curvy body. Like, what a weird way to describe someone that's, at one point she finds her like laying on the floor in pain. It's like, oh, I see her curvy body. Like, she's in the floor in agony. Why is that what you're describing her as? Anyway, I did actually really like Maya's character. I liked some more expansion we got to see with some werewolves, and also we got to see more of the vampires. Obviously there was a lot more fighting. Clary's finding out a bit more about her power. Luke is one of my favorite characters in the series. I really like Luke. So yeah, I'm excited. I actually kind of devoured like the last 150 pages of this. So that's the first book we read in the month of July, and yeah, that were my thoughts on it. It's now the 12th of July and I have finished my second book for the month. This is Close to Me by Amanda Reynolds. This is, I think it's marketed as a thriller. I would say it's more of a mystery family drama. It is about our main character, Jo, who has an accident where she falls down the stairs and cannot remember anything that happened in the last year of her life. And it's basically a story of her trying to remember what's happened over the last year, what happened to her family, why her family feels so fractured, what's going on with her husband, did she have an affair? She starts to remember things that she feels like she might have been lying to her family, starting a new life, all of this stuff. The book's layout is set out so that each chapter goes back and forth between present day, after the fall, as they're like titled, and then like goes back in time to like the year before and works its way through the months as the chapters go on. So that kind of works one after the other, which I think was a really interesting layout for the book and did help move the book along, so you kind of got some backstory and then got where her was. It did get repetitive in that she wouldn't remember stuff, but we would be told stuff, so then she would keep thinking about them in like the current day chapters, but we would know what was going on, and so it would be quite repetitive in that sense. I think overall I rated this 3 stars. It was an okay book. I haven't read tons in this genre. It was, I think, mediumly paced. It was very easy to read. It was from the first person perspective, which I find very easy, and it was just quite like digestible writing. None of the characters were overly sympathetic or great. Our main character was sympathetic in her like memory loss, but like her family I think were just a bit awful to her. Like her, not awful to her, but her kids weren't really like, I didn't like either of her kids. I didn't think they were very good to her, and I did feel sympathy actually for her in that sense, because she was like a stay-at-home mum, and so I guess all her life had been really her children, and they just kind of felt a bit distant. Obviously there's relationship issues with her husband. There are other men in this book that are just kind of trash. There is one character, Rose, who was who was like a really supportive character who I really liked. The ending for this was a letdown for me. I think the chapter, like the second to last chapter was the big build-up, the big conclusion, like everything coming to a head. And then the last chapter was like a 3-month time skip, which I hate in books because it kind of feels then it's like it's glossing over stuff. I feel like there was like, yeah, just kind of some plot points, obviously that were put in there for like red herrings to try, I guess, like divert you and confuse you, but they ended up feeling a bit rushed as well in their like execution, and I don't think it could have been, I think, more fleshed out. I will say this book does touch a bit on like domestic violence and like support and sexual harassment, And I think it did do those topics well as they were fleshed out, and I think it was done quite well. It has like a setting of a drop-in centre that helps people out for a multitude of things, but like some of them being like support. And it does also talk about her going to like a group therapy for like trauma support group therapy for like her injury, which I thought was a really nice showing of that support and that she got good stuff out of it. And the main characters in this are also quite middle class, which is like a part of like the book, them having money, but that also I guess creates a bit of a divide in my connection to the characters, especially like her kids who I guess have this kind of upbringing and then get given a lot of like help and support, kind of lessens my sympathy to them, which I guess it's not like I had to feel sympathetic to them, but like there's this kind of privilege aspect to the family, which is I guess a part of the book. I guess, well, it kind of goes into her lifestyle of being able to be a a stay-at-home mum, and then not having to work in like her 50s when her kids are grown and at university and whatnot. Overall, I did enjoy it. Like I said, I got through it very quickly. I would read more stuff by Amanda Reynolds. I do have another book of hers that I bought when I went to her signing to get this one signed. So I will be reading that book at least. And yeah, I probably will read stuff in the future. Like I said, there were those little bits, but it was such an easy read and it was like a nice break from some of the other stuff that I read. So this is the second book that I have read in July, and yeah, well, let's go on to the next book. So it's now the 17th. I have read some books that I haven't spoke about, so I'm kind of trying to catch up today and talk about the books that I've read over the last 5 days. We'll start with Percy Jackson and the Titan's Curse. I finished this in a day, which was successful to my challenge, and I absolutely adored it. I really have been enjoying this series. It's a really easy series to get into. Obviously, this is the third in the series, so I won't go over much into the plot, but it does get straight into the action. We meet a lot of new characters, or we continue on with some new characters that we met towards the end of last book, and I really liked that. I liked that the focus, one of our main characters is kind of not in the focus, so we get this chance to have these other characters become more of a focus, which I really liked. We got introduced to some new gods and goddesses. I am not the most versed in Greek mythology, so I don't really know sometimes a lot of who they are, who we're looking at when they talk about stuff that like happened, and I don't know who they are. So there is a lot of that happens sometimes, and I don't also bother really looking it up because I just kind of let the story tell me, which I think it does do in a way that's really good, that it doesn't really expect you to know the ins and outs of these myths, because it does kind of give you bits of information about them, which is, I think, well done. Percy's development is really good. I really like seeing him grow up in these books. So he's 14 now in this series. I think he was 12 in the first book. This was a 4-star for me. I think probably a 4.5, and I'm excited to see where it progresses, because we have kind of established the main kind of plot points. We've established, I guess, what the big bad battle at the end is going to be, and so I'm excited to see that develop. But overall, I really enjoyed Percy Jackson and the Titan's Curse. And the next book that I read, which has not got as happy of a review, is Wind in the Willows. This is by Kenneth Grahame. And I didn't like it. This is a 2-star for me. There were chapters that I found entertaining, but then it was just some random chapters. It didn't really have, I think, like a solid kind of plot. It was more like little stories set in this world with a little bit of a plot that was kind of happening like sparse throughout it with Mr. Toad. Mr. Toad's chapters, some of his chapters were probably the funniest and most entertaining, but then also he wasn't a very likable character, and it was random as hell. Like, these are animals that I don't know if they're supposed to be huge animals, because like at one point Mr. Toad gets arrested by humans or interacts with humans, and so I'm like, is this a giant toad then that's being arrested, or are these tiny humans? And like, they have a horse at one point. I don't know, I think it was just a bit odd. I did like Mr. Rat. I think he was a really nice friend and a really good friend, and I think actually Toad didn't really deserve any of his friends, but it was just really random. And like, there was a chapter in it about one of Mr. Otter's kids that I felt was really out of place and didn't really add anything to the story, and just was a bit random. Overall, yeah, it was just a bit random, and I'm not the biggest fan, I think, of this kind of classic writing. I do like some classics, particularly Jane Austen, but the ones that I've read that I think are more like early 1900s have not been my favourite. This and Five Children and It have not particularly been my favourite, where sometimes it's just pages of like rambling, not dialogue, just rambling descriptions of random, and I don't know. It wasn't my favourite, but it was short, and I kind of got through it, and I kind of didn't read it in one sitting. I was doing it sporadically while reading other bits, which is kind of the way that I will take classics like this that are a bit more droning, is how I would describe the chapters. Then I read Moon Over Soho. I listened to this predominantly on audiobook, but I did also read it and like do kind of an immersive hybrid read. This follows on directly after the last book, but with a new case. So Peter is kind of having to discover a new case. The Rivers of London weren't in this as much. Ash was a bit, and Tyburn, so one of the sisters, but otherwise it was more focusing on new cases. I really like that about this kind of book. So this is only the second one, but how it has these kind of police cases that are kind of individuals to the books. It kind of feels like a kind of, you know, monster of the book kind of thing, but you also are learning more about magic and the world of monsters and creatures and such. It does deal with some of the consequences of the fallout from the last book, particularly with Leslie and Nightingale. We kind of see Peter more on his own and having to navigate the crime world. I really like about this series that it's an urban fantasy and our main character is a cop, but the cops are aware that magic exists, the Met Police, and so there is a division that deal with it. So like the higher up cops know this stuff exists, and it's not like he's having to try and hide what he's doing or pretend that it's just like natural causes. He can very, you know, something supernatural will happen and they call him in, and I like that element, that it's not having to hide and pretend this is an underground world. They're very aware this exists and they have like means of combating it, which I think is a really interesting take. I think a lot of the kind of urban or like realistic magic stuff you see, it's always still hidden, and it's not in this, which I really enjoyed. There was 2 different cases that was kind of happening in this, and they kind of like ended up interspersing, and I really liked that. And yeah, overall I think this is a really interesting, fun series. I will be carrying on with this series. I did listen to a audiobook as well, which was the 8th book in the How to Train Your Dragon series. This was How to Steal a Dragon's Heart. This was a really good book. I really enjoy this series. It's narrated by David Tennant. He does such amazing voice work for these books. Yeah, this one we're getting more, I guess, into what the final, I guess, plot and some wrap up of this series will be. We're learning about like riddles or like prophecies to do with Hiccup, our main character. We got to see more of Fish Legs in this, and like a couple of older characters were back, like Horrendous Alvin makes his reappearance back in this, who is like Hiccup's nemesis. And these books are just kind of a good fun read. Like I said, I listen to them and I think they're really easy to listen to. They're really easy to get involved with. I listen to them while I'm working, while I'm like cycling, all sorts, and I just really enjoy them, and I would really recommend them. Like I said, it's book 8, so I can't really talk much about it, but overall, I really enjoyed it. And then the last thing that I have completed at the moment, as of the 17th, is the manga My Broken Mariko. This is a standalone manga. It is by Waka Hiroko. And yeah, it is a single volume, which I don't really have that many, or have read that many single volume manga that aren't like BL ones, I guess. This deals with a friend who, at the beginning of the book, finds out that her best friend has died, taken her own life, and she decides to, as like, I guess, a last gesture, to take her ashes and scatter them somewhere, and to basically kind of save her from her father for her like ashes. You get to know like Mariko had a really troublesome past, particularly with men and her father, and our main character, whose name I can't actually remember, Shino, had always tried to be there for her and to protect her. And yeah, it was just a quite short story. There's also a chapter at the end that's about a completely different story, which that was fine. It wasn't that interesting, which was like this amount. But yeah, I think it was a nice little short read. It deals with grief. It did make me tear up at one point, so I think they did that quite nicely. I think the art style was nice, but it was also sometimes quite erratic. But I think it played nicely with colour and tone on highlighting some of the darker scenes. It wasn't anything like spectacular, but overall, for a one shot, it was decent. I always like reading these to see kind of how much goes into it and how like much you can tell a story just from such a short amount of book. That makes sense. But yeah, so that was the next one that I've read. That's where we're at as of the 17th of July. So now back to me. It is the 4th of August as I'm doing this wrap up. So let's get on to what was left in July. First up, and probably one of my favourite reads for July, was A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. This is a young adult mystery series about a young girl, Pip, who, for one of her school projects, decides to look into an old, like 6-year murder case. It's a closed case. Everyone thinks it's done and dusted, and she doesn't think the person that is labelled as the murderer is the actual murderer. There is also the case of the fact that the person that this student was accused of murdering, actually her body was never found, so no one knows where she went, what this guy did with her, allegedly, and Pip goes on this journey for her school project that she wants to kind of figure out the truth. It develops way past just a simple school project. She ends up befriending the younger brother of the guy that was accused of the murder, and they kind of go on this journey. It's a really good book. This was my first kind of foray into YA mystery. I've read a few older mysteries, and I found this so enjoyable. I think the cast of characters were really good. I think Pip as a main lead was fantastic. I think she had great friends, a really nice family unit as well, and I think that really endeared me to this story much more than other mysteries that I've read. Some of the other mysteries I've read, if they haven't got like, while the mysteries sometimes are intriguing, if the cast of characters around them aren't like appealing, or I'm not able to feel like I can connect or with them, I don't find it as appealing. But in this book, I think there was a great cast of characters, and I think the mysteries kind of kept building, and there was a bunch of different routes that kind of did end up all coming together and things were getting fulfilled. You do get the whole mystery in this book. I was worried that because I know it's a trilogy, I'd have to read 3 books to find out the conclusion of the main storyline in this, but you don't. I have read the synopsis for the second book, so I'm guessing, like, I don't know if this was ever planned to be a trilogy, and I don't actually know, and I've not looked into it, but my idea was that this was such a big hit that, like, other people wanted more in that series. I will eventually read the rest of the series. I'm not in a huge rush because I think there will be standalones, or the last 2 will potentially run into each other. I'm not sure, but I think this was such a good book. So this for me was a 5-star read, and it makes me really excited to read more Holly Jackson stuff. I do have her book 5 Survive, which I have yet to read, but I'm very excited to now read. I won't be keeping this book just because it is a proof copy, so it's not like a lovely copy, and also I don't know if I will reread it, and if I do feel like I want to reread it, I would either potentially get it from my library or would buy a book box with all 3 in them. The 2 sequels, as well as there is a prequel book, I will either get out from my library or I'll read it on Kindle. I'll see as I go, but yeah, I am going to give this to my sister before I unhaul it because I think she'll really enjoy it. But yeah, I do really recommend this book, which isn't an unpopular opinion. This is a very big book, so I'm just late to the party, but I really liked that. So I'm going to leave my last book to the end because it has some more heavy topics that if people aren't interested in, they can click out of the video. But first, I read volume 21 of Boys Over Flowers. This is just continuing on again with this series. There was some stuff in this that I didn't like. A big trope in this throughout the kind of whole of this series is miscommunication. There is a lot of miscommunication, or even not even really miscommunication, just non-communication. People keeping secrets, people not telling each other the truth, and by people I mean the main couple. And it's frustrating as the audience to constantly see this. Obviously that kind of is adding to the drama, adding to the like the longevity of the series, because it is 36 volumes and this is only 21. So you know, a lot more stuff has to happen, but it's just frustrating. You know, when something good finally happens with our main couple, something will come in, and instead of like talking to each other about it, they kind of try to protect the other one by lying about stuff or breaking up with one, and that's frustrating. But I am enjoying the series regardless, and I will be continuing on with it. Yeah, so that was it. I don't really have much more to say about this. This is a romance. I've spoken about it before. And then I finally read Heartstoppers Volume 1. Now, I have watched the series, and I will be watching Season 2 when it comes out. Maybe today? I don't actually remember when it comes out. Soon. I did enjoy this. This is actually one of the first comics, graphic novels that I've read. I've read a lot of manga, and I've read like more superhero comics, but I've never really read much non-superhero comics, Western comics. Yeah, everything I've read has either been like from Marvel or DC, I think. So this was kind of the first graphic novel that isn't one of those that I've read. And I do think, because I am used to, especially used to manga, I found it a bit simplistic in its style. I'm not comparing them in the sense of like one's better than the other, because they're different. But like what I'm used to compared to like what this was. So like even in like say like an interaction, there's just kind of a lot more going on than is in here. There's a lot of like white space, and I think that is potentially also because I believe was this a webcomic first? But yeah, so I think that was kind of an adjustment, getting used to that. Even sometimes like, you know, there's not a lot always going on in like the backgrounds in like panels and stuff. So that was different from what I was used to. I did enjoy it. I do like this, and I do like that she has her own style, and it does feel really nice. I really like the kind of consistency throughout the story of the leaves, and how that kind of is on the cover, and you know, throughout different panels you see the leaves. I quite like the handwritten style of the text. I think it really adds to the style of the comic, and I also, having read this, do think it works really, really well as a TV series. I think if you are a fan of the TV series, you don't necessarily need to read this, because it is exactly the same, and I think the TV series did it in a really good way. So yeah, I am going to continue with the rest of the series because I do like reading graphic novels. That was my whole thoughts on it. But anyway, yeah, I am going to continue with the series, and I did enjoy this. And then the last book that I read of the month was A Clash of Kings. I had about 400 pages of this left to read, and so I finished it this month, and I really enjoyed it for the most part. And this is kind of where I will be talking about some of quite the serious topics that go on in this book. So like, if that is not to your comfort level, please feel free to leave. There is a lot of violence against women in these books, and it's so uncomfortable to read about. I actually can't believe how toned down in some senses the TV show was compared to in this, because I guess obviously because you like, oh, it's not as violent just reading about it, but it feels it, and it's uncomfortable sometimes. Like, I do think there is a level of not necessary in the level of violence there is to women in these books, and how people speak about that. And it's not really, it is women, but it's more poor women. None of the noble women at this point that I'm in the book kind of get treated as badly. Actually, that's a lie, one of the noble women did, but because she's, I think, overweight and considered stupid, it's kind of mocked by other characters in the series. She's not a very big character in it, but she got assaulted 50 times by men, and then went a bit, I think understandably a bit, not crazy, I don't want to say crazy, but like she would stay in her room and she would be a bit like hysterical. And like, you know, other characters would be like, oh, it's just like sex. It's just, I don't know, it just gives me like, and obviously there is people always, I think, I guess, comment on, especially in the TV series, like the realness of it, how like, you know, oh, it's, you know, he's trying to like depict times of, I guess, a time it would be, but obviously with a fantasy aspect. I'm like, okay, but if it has that fantasy aspect, does it also need to have the extreme violence to women aspect? Even in just like little bits that I'll be enjoying like a scene, and by enjoying, I mean like enjoying reading the scene, like saying a scene that's happening with Arya, and then there'll be just depictions of some of the stuff that they happen at Harrenhal with the women, or she overhears a conversation that's just about like a nasty assault on women, and it's just uncomfortable, and that does take away some of my enjoyment from this series. I am a big fan of the TV show, more so than obviously the beginning than the end, but I do really like the TV show, and that was toned down, and I am surprised by that. That's not to say there's not violence towards men in this, because there is, obviously, but it's from men, whereas the violence to the women is, from what I can remember, but from what I've read so far, it's predominantly women, men that are being violent to women, and that's uncomfortable for me to read. I don't think it needed to be as much as prevalent. I think you could talk about it without being as necessarily graphic sometimes as there is in it, and I also don't think it's necessary, even though it's like, again, trying to have this realness of this world, but like, this is also a world with demon shadow babies and dragons, but the violence to women has to be like an asset, you know, it has to stay in. Yeah, multiple things like that in this book. Another critique I always have is just it's long. It's long, and not in like a necessarily good way, in the sense of like sometimes the descriptions go on, and it feels pointless that this, whatever I'm reading about, is being described to such an extent, like especially in terms of like food and stuff. Like in one page, I think Dany was drinking wine, and in one page it got described the exact same way, that it tasted like summer. And I'm like, I get it, she's drinking a nice glass of wine, you know? For long descriptions, I do think the world building and the plot is so intricate and really good, and like there's so many good ideas, and like the world building in terms of like religion and like, you know, the different people and all that, it's so good. I do absolutely think that. I just think sometimes the mundane descriptions of things that are like going on that don't have an overall like effect to the world and the plot is a lot. It took me like every page looks thick like these, you know, and it took me a while to get through. I do think, however, one of the really interesting things is, because again, I've come from watching the TV show, how little of the main players in the war we actually see from their perspective. And I'm talking like Stannis and Jon and Renly. You only ever get kind of their story through other characters, and I think that's really interesting. Like the whole war at the end, the whole battle at the end of Battle of the Bridgewater, I think it's called, you see through Tyrion, and you kind of get second-hand results through Sansa's eyes. You never see from Stannis's, you never see from like Tywin's, you never see from anyone else's, the Hound. You don't actually ever get that, and I think that's a really interesting way of moving the story along, kind of like how, showing how like, I think that's a really good way of doing it, because you can have then all of this stuff happening without really having it to be the people that are the main players. You know, every kind of Stannis scene we get is from Davos's point of view, who is my favourite character. And yeah, I think that's really cool, and I do think that's really interesting. I read the last 400 pages this month of this book, and we didn't see Rob at all in this book, because Catelyn wasn't with him. She was, you know, first of all with Renly, and then with her father and her brother, so we didn't see any of that, which again I think is really interesting. I just think that's an interesting way of telling the story, and I did really enjoy that. I do also, however, my critique, which I know it comes together, this is one of the first very big multiple POV fantasy series I've read. I'd love to read more. I think I could do one at a time. And so I'm not kind of used to, when the POV changes, obviously the characters that are together tend to be, but you just see different aspects of what's currently going on through their perspectives. So I will be really into a scene, you know, I'll be really into something, say the Battle of the Bridgewater that's going on, I'll be really into that, I'll be reading from Sansa, I'll be reading from Tyrion, and then it will go to Dany or Jon, and I am bored. Not necessarily bored, well, Dany's storyline I find boring, but like, it really takes you out of that. Because obviously, especially Dany, she's not even on the same planet, she's not even on the same country as them, so her storyline feels extremely removed, which again I know is eventually because they're going to come together, and it has to kind of have that development of this character to kind of come together, but it just, yeah, it's like cuts in, and I'm really into it, and reading, you know, back and forth all these different chapters, and then it will go to Dany, and I'll be like, oh, another Dany chapter. And it's the same with Jon as well, because even though Jon is in the same country, his story is quite far removed, and again, I know it's all going to come together, but yeah, that just sometimes the pacings of that, which maybe it's on purpose, but it feels, you know, it'll be coming quite hard and heavy, and there'll be a lot of stuff happening, and then it'll just go slow, because we get a Danny chapter. But anyway, overall, I still rated this book 4 stars. I still had a really good time in reading it, other than those criticisms, especially with the violence to women. We also actually did get the kind of, which I don't remember if it ever was shared in the TV series, but we did get like the graphic details of how Ned's brother and dad were killed, and that was quite sad. Like, that was quite sad. But yeah, overall, I actually really enjoyed the book, and I'm going to carry on with the series. I take my time with this series. When I first got the series, I was like, I'm going to be up to date. I want to make sure I'm up to date for Winds of Winter, which is still a thing that I'd love to do, but I just feel like I've got loads of time to do it now because who knows when that book's coming out. But anyway, that is my wrap up for July. Yes, this will probably go up towards the end of August, but anyway, and yeah, thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you again hopefully soon. Bye.